ICE and the FBI move on Minnesota, touching the offices of Governor Tim Walz and the state's biggest mayors, as more than 3,000 arrests stack up, all tied to a fentanyl surge ripping through the Somali community.
Police! Police, come out with your hands up! Open it! Last warning!
What started as a drug crackdown didn't stay on the streets for long. At first, federal agents were arresting dealers and pulling pills off the street, but the numbers only accelerated. Fentanyl seizures spiked, overdose deaths kept climbing, and the price of the drug collapsed to as low as $1 a pill, a sign that supply was now deeply embedded in the community.
We have brought down crime very substantially in Minnesota. We've taken out thousands of hard criminals, hardened, vicious, horrible criminals.
That's when investigators realized Minnesota had become a critical distribution hub. But who was in charge of that hub? As ICE and the FBI expanded their operations, arrests surged into the thousands, and many of those were tied to distribution networks concentrated inside the Somali community. But here's the bizarre part. As ICE went after the suspects, they were blocked by top Minnesota officials including Governor Walz and Mayor Frey, who appeared to be protecting the criminals. They condemned the operation. They told ICE to leave and warned residents to resist and document arrests.
Local law enforcement say they've never seen anything like it. The price of fentanyl is now having a major impact on the opioid crisis in the Twin Cities metro.
But Trump wasn't backing down. Instead, he sent ICE and the FBI after those officials. What they found blew this whole investigation wide open and revealed some shocking information about why Minnesota's drug problem got this bad in the first place.
They can literally go out down the streets in Minneapolis and get it within 10 minutes.
By the time ICE and the FBI stepped in, Minnesota was already flashing red. It started with pills. Street teams kept finding fentanyl in places it hadn't dominated before, not just during raids, but in routine stops, traffic pulls, and small apartment searches shoved pockets in backpacks. All of a sudden, it was everywhere.
Becoming dangerously cheap at this point.
A longtime Hennepin County Sheriff's narcotics investigator confirmed is going for $1 to $2 a pill in the metro. That's down from about $20 just a couple of years ago.
That drop from a $20 price point is not normal, and cheap drugs don't mean weak demand. In fact, in most cases, they indicate easy access to supply.
For years now, it's become a choice black market drug, and dealers have found easy ways of manufacturing it on the street.
But what happened next was what raised alarms for federal officials. The price dropped. Investigators started hearing the same thing from different corners of the state. The synthetic drug was now selling for $1 to $2 a pill. An increased supply can only mean one thing: a rise in overdose calls. When investigators looked at the data, one trend stood out. Overdose deaths were climbing fastest inside Minnesota's Somali community, especially among young people.
They say young people are dying from overdoses at a record and heartbreaking rate.
While that doesn't mean the community caused the crisis, it certainly doesn't rule that out. But it did mean the crisis had embedded itself there. To get to the bottom of it, task forces were sent out into the streets.
So what we're doing today is called a buy-bust operation, and this gives us a second chance to recover and seize these narcotics after they've already entered the United States.
Here's what typically happens in operations like that.
We are rusing the traffickers into meeting with our undercover. Our undercover is acting as a drug trafficker himself, and he's acting as if he's about to buy these bulk narcotics.
I've been working as an undercover for about 4 years.
Soon enough, the same names, associates, and phone numbers started popping up. These names popped up even at different street corners, on different days with different officers. What looked like random street busts started fitting together like a puzzle. That's when they got the full picture. Minnesota wasn't set up to be a pass-through or a highway stop. Investigators concluded Minnesota had become a distribution hub.
The purpose of this trafficker is to sell a bulk amount of narcotics that would later be distributed in smaller amounts by drug dealers.
I'm in communication with all these drug traffickers in Mexico and here in the United States. My job is to set up the deals, set up a meet location.
Once the undercover establishes that these narcotics are there, He will say the bust word, and the agents will converge onto the traffickers and make an arrest.
Drugs weren't just moving through the state. They were actively being stored, broken down, repackaged, sold, and replaced. And every time local agencies pulled one dealer off the street, another one filled the gap. With the full picture, the mission changed. ICE and the FBI were brought in to dismantle networks as part of Operation Metro Surge that hit Minnesota a few months ago. Phones were mapped, money trails tracked, arrest records cross-checked. However, as arrests swept through Minnesota, investigators noticed patterns started forming around repeat fentanyl arrests tied to the same circles. Week after week, arrests stacked up. 100, 500, 1,000. By the time the operation reached full speed, more than 3,000 arrests were on the board, and Minnesota, by that point, wasn't just fighting fentanyl, it was drowning in it.
Boy, these are rough characters. These are all criminal, illegal aliens that, in many cases, they're murderers, they're drug lords, drug dealers, they're the mentally insane. There's some of them who are brutal killers, they're mentally insane. They're killers, but they're insane. These are just in Minnesota.
By the time the federal arrest numbers were released, Minnesota was at its breaking point. Thousands of arrests were tallied in public briefings. Even Trump chimed in, calling the arrests the worst of the worst, listing criminal histories and violent charges tied to the surge in the Twin Cities. But as the numbers climbed toward 3,000, something unexpected happened. The people in power at the state and city level began pushing back with equal force. The governor, the mayor of Minneapolis, even the mayor of St. Paul all publicly criticized federal tactics. Now, they didn't just criticize the arrests, but how they were being carried out. They said the presence of ICE agents was destabilizing communities, intimidating residents, and disrupting everyday life.
And at grocery stores, at bus stops, even at our schools. They're breaking windows, dragging pregnant women down the street, just plain grabbing Minnesotans and shoving them into unmarked vans, kidnapping innocent people with no warning and no due process.
In response, the federal government said this.
It was a very chaotic scene. We know that our ICE law enforcement are facing rampant violence against them, a highly coordinated campaign.
Nobody was buying that. It got so bad that local lawsuits were filed against ICE and the federal government. Civil rights concerns were raised, riots and protests flared, and federal authorities took notice, mostly because they seemed to be encouraged by Minnesotan officials who released statements that began to look to the Department of Justice like obstruction.
Indeed, as hard as we will fight in the courts and at the ballot box, we cannot and will not let violence prevail. You're angry, I'm angry. Angry's not a strong enough word. You have an absolute right to peacefully film ICE agents as they conduct these activities. So carry your phone with you at all times. And if you see these ICE agents in your neighborhood, take out that phone and hit record.
Around the same time the surge was making headlines, federal prosecutors hit back by opening a new front, a legal investigation into whether public statements and actions by Minnesota officials had unlawfully interfered with federal enforcement. Then, the subpoenas arrived, first to the governor's office, then to the mayor of Minneapolis, then to the mayor of St. Paul, and others were included too.
The U.S. Department of Justice issued grand jury subpoenas to 6 Minnesota officials for allegedly obstructing an immigration enforcement investigation there.
These were orders to produce records, communications, and documents connected to the federal operation.
Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey confirming that they have received those subpoenas. 4 other individuals were also issued that summons, including the state's attorney general.
Suddenly, the story shifted, because once subpoenas are issued, the operation takes on a new shape. Subpoenas give prosecutors the right to probe into the issue deeper, and what they found was certainly unexpected.
The investigation is looking into whether or not those officials obstructed a sweeping immigration operation through public statements that they made. Federal prosecutors are focusing on the possible violation of a conspiracy statute.
This is why both ICE and the FBI were surged to Minnesota that first. The numbers that were coming out of the Twin Cities were scary to say the least. The Drug Enforcement Administration reported that Minnesota saw a record number of pills seized in 2023, far higher than in neighboring states.
Authorities are calling it the largest drug bust in Minnesota history.
We are taking you inside the state's biggest bust ever. Investigators say that the dealers used the hottest toy in town to smuggle the deadly drugs.
That was a 127% jump from the year before, and it made Minnesota one of the hardest hit states in the Midwest. And it wasn't slowing down. Federal agents described the flow as an avalanche, with pills showing up in metro neighborhoods, rural outposts, and even in seized packages mailed into the state.
It's like people are the walking dead out here.
DEA announcing Wednesday it seized a record 417,000 pills in Minnesota in 2023, more than twice the number of any other state in the region. The DEA's Minnesota office says drug distributors are trying almost anything, like mailing stuffed teddy bears to addresses in the metro.
But seizures alone didn't stop the supply, because while law enforcement were pulling them off the street, distributors were still pushing into it.
It is like an avalanche. They're seeing our efforts and they're trying to counter that with just sending more.
MBH says most involve fentanyl. The DEA says 7 out of 10 pills they've seized contain potentially deadly doses.
It's just getting worse.
Yeah.
That informed the hard conclusion that Minnesota was a central place where pills arrived and then spread outward into the surrounding region. But with all the information they've gathered so far, will federal investigators be able to trace the supply chain right to where it was coming from? We'll have to find out. And what's worse, around the same time the seizures went up, the price also went down. That stood out to investigators because that level of price drop only happens when supply outpaces law enforcement pressure and distribution networks are deeply rooted. That kind of cheap implies a distribution network is deeply rooted within the community, and that could clearly be seen in the streets. Police in Minnesota weren't just seeing pills at traffic stops. They were seeing them in neighborhoods, in hospital reports, and coming up again and again in overdose calls. By the time federal investigators were tallying arrests, another story was unfolding in living rooms, prayer halls, and dinner tables across Minnesota. Overdose reports showed something unsettling. Fentanyl wasn't hitting Minnesota evenly. It was tearing through specific neighborhoods faster than others. And inside the Twin Cities, one community kept appearing in the same reports again and again.
Tonight, elders in the Somali community are also sounding an alarm about fentanyl.
The reason why I'm sitting here is not only for my son, it's for all sons and all children of Minnesota.
Somali elders began sounding the alarm. They described the use and overdose deaths growing devastatingly and faster than anyone could keep up. These weren't criminals in the abstract. They were sons, neighbors, classmates. In one telling moment, a Minneapolis mother described how her son seemed to have his whole life ahead of him. A job offer, dreams, a future, only to die the same night he came home.
That day when he came home, he has applied for a security job near the airport. Says, here's the offer letter that I received. I'm picking up the uniform tonight. I'm starting the job tomorrow. And that same night is when he passed away.
And their voices weren't isolated. Data and community advocates showed disparities that were hard to ignore. Somali Minnesotans were dying of opioid overdoses at more than twice the rate of other residents.
Minnesotans of color have died at disproportionately high rates throughout the opioid epidemic.
But what made this stand out wasn't just the number of deaths, it was also the speed. Investigators noticed that fentanyl use in the Somali community surged at once, and when supply spikes that fast, it usually means access is close, very close. To investigators, that raised a hard question. If fentanyl was this cheap, if overdoses were clustering this tightly, and if arrests kept overlapping within the same social networks, then the supply might be embedded inside it. That doesn't mean everyone is involved. Far from it. Most families are victims, not participants.
But as of 2021 in Minneapolis, the number of Black residents dying of opioid-related overdoses actually surpassed the number of white resident deaths.
But from an enforcement standpoint, embedded networks are the hardest to dismantle because they hide behind trust, language, family ties, and silence. And silence mattered here.
Data specific to the city's Somali community is tough to come by and likely underreported.
The other kids who are using drugs that I know of and are sleeping outside, they're neither deaf or alive. They're right in the middle of it.
Because in many families, overdoses were kept quiet because of stigma. As a result, many overdoses went unreported or attributed to other causes, so families could grieve without judgment. That silence hid the scale of the problem. Meanwhile, advocates on the streets were seeing it firsthand. Community leaders were handing out Narcan and tea in public plazas, knowing that young people were slipping away in ways that official numbers couldn't fully capture.
Islam strictly forbids drug use, the stigma keeping families from reporting deaths as overdoses.
This wasn't a statistic in a briefing. It was a mother burying her child, a neighbor trying to save a friend, an elder watching a generation crumble. By this point, investigators are focusing on the patterns emerging. You see, they're working with a set of competing theories, whether the fentanyl surge is being driven by a small number of tightly connected distributors, whether trust-based networks allowed the supply to move faster and quieter than usual, and whether community-level access explains why the drug spread so efficiently before enforcement caught up. None of those theories have been charged, none have been proven in court, but they're shaping how the investigation moves forward. Federal agencies are now comparing overdose data, arrest records, pricing trends, and communication networks side by side, trying to understand not just who moved the drugs, but how the system protected itself long enough to grow.